Chapter 7: The Walking School. When Aristotle returned to Athens and opened his school at the Lyceum, he did not create a shrine to himself. He created a place with movement in it. The Lyceum was not hidden away like a mystery cult, nor was it only a room where a master delivered polished speeches to silent admirers. It was a gymnasium, a grove, a public place on the edge of the city's ordinary noise. Men trained their bodies nearby. Citizens passed through. Dust rose from the paths. In the shaded walkways, Aristotle and his students talked, argued, sorted, remembered, corrected, and began again. Later people called them peripatetics, the walkers. The name may have come from the covered walkways where they met, or from the habit of pacing while teaching. Either way, it fits. Aristotle's school felt less like a monument than a disciplined walk through the world. One morning, the subject might be constitutions. Another day it might be cuttlefish, thunder, tragic poetry, friendship, syllogisms, or the parts of animals. Nothing was too humble to be noticed if it could reveal how nature worked. This was the first real ripple of Aristotle's life, not a finished system placed on a shelf, but a community trained to look carefully. He had left Plato's academy, but he had not left argument behind. Athens still remembered Socrates, still heard the old music of questions and counter-questions. Plato's followers continued to defend a vision of reality in which the highest truth belonged to changeless forms, more perfect than the shifting things we touch and see. Aristotle did not simply deny that inheritance. He had been formed by it. But his eyes kept moving downward, toward horses, laws, speeches, embryos, habits, and weather. If there was form, he wanted to find it in the thing. If there was purpose, he wanted to see it in growth and action. If there was knowledge, he wanted it to survive contact with particulars. That difference gave the Lyceum its energy. It also gave Aristotle's followers a shared task. They were not merely told what to believe. They were trained in a way of asking, what is this thing? Of what is it made? What gives it shape? What brought it about? What is it for? These questions, the famous four causes in living use, could be carried into almost any subject. They turned philosophy into a portable craft. The most important carrier of that craft was Theophrastus. If Aristotle was the founder, Theophrastus was the keeper of the flame after the founder's death. He inherited leadership of the Lyceum, and with it, the enormous practical burden of making a school last beyond the charisma of one teacher. That is no small thing. Many circles collapse when the central figure disappears. The Lyceum endured because Theophrastus understood that Aristotle's deepest gift was not a pile of conclusions, but a disciplined appetite for explanation. Theophrastus took that appetite into the plant world with extraordinary patience. His writings on plants read, across the distance of centuries, like the notes of a man who has spent a long time bending over roots, stems, leaves, bark, seeds, soils, and seasons. He wanted to know how plants differ, why they grow where they grow, how cultivation changes them, what injuries they survive, what uses people make of them. In him, the Lyceum's method became almost botanical in spirit, branching, observing, classifying, returning to the same living things with sharper questions. This mattered because Greek knowledge of nature had often mixed observation with rumor, practical law, and inherited stories. Aristotle had done some of this too. He was not a modern laboratory scientist, and his works contain errors. But the peripatetic habit pushed toward a new seriousness. A plant was not just a useful herb or a poetic ornament. It was a living form with structure, development, causes, and differences worth recording. That quiet shift helped prepare later natural history. Long before modern biology had microscopes, genetics, or evolutionary theory, the Lyceum made classification and comparison intellectually respectable. Another student, Eudemus of Rhodes, carried the ripple in a different direction. Where Theophrastus extended Aristotle's natural investigations, Eudemus seems to have cared deeply about the history of inquiry itself. He wrote about mathematics, astronomy, and theology, though much of his work survives only in fragments and reports. That loss is part of the story. The ancient world has come down to us like a damaged library after a storm. Shelves missing, titles known only from quotations, arguments preserved by opponents. We should not pretend to see everything clearly. Still, Eudemus lets us glimpse a peripatetic mind interested in lineage. How did earlier thinkers reason? How had geometry developed? What paths had thought taken before arriving at the present question? That historical instinct enlarged Aristotle's project. To study knowledge was not only to state doctrines, but to understand the roads by which human beings had reached them. The Lyceum began to look backward as well as outward. Aristoxenus of Tarentum shows still another path. He was associated with music theory, and in his work the Aristotelian respect for experience enters through the ear. Music was not reduced to abstract number alone. It had to be heard. Pitch, rhythm, and melody involved perception trained by practice. Aristoxenus did not simply abandon reason for sensation, rather, he treated listening as a disciplined act. A good judge of music was not a person with a formula alone, but someone whose perception had been educated. That is a surprisingly Aristotelian idea. Virtue, for Aristotle, is not a rule memorized in the mind, while the rest of the person remains untouched. It is a trained responsiveness. The courageous person sees danger differently from the rash person and the coward. The generous person feels the claim of need differently from the miser. So too the trained musician hears order where the untrained ear hears only sound. The Lyceum's influence reached the arts by insisting that judgment lives in the meeting of reason and cultivated perception. Dicaeurchus of Messene carried the peripatetic spirit toward geography, biography, politics, and questions about the soul. He seems to have been more worldly, less inclined toward grand metaphysics, more interested in the shape of human life on earth. In such students we see that Aristotle's circle was not a choir singing one note. It was a workshop producing different kinds of thinkers: botanists, historians of science, music theorists, political observers, logicians, collectors of constitutions. A school becomes powerful when it can generate disagreement without losing its center. The Lyceum did that. Its center was method. The atmosphere around Aristotle was not one of universal applause. Plato's academy remained a rival presence. Xenocrates and others preserved a more mathematical and otherworldly Platonism. The Megarians and other sharp logicians delighted in paradoxes and puzzles that tested the boundaries of argument. Rhetoricians cared about persuasion in the public world, where a clever speech could move a jury faster than a careful classification. The city was full of competing temperaments. This friction helped Aristotle's school. A doctrine protected from challenge grows soft. The Lyceum had to answer rivals. Against Platonists, Aristotle's followers had to explain why form was not sealed away in another realm, but present in living substances. Against skeptics of teleology, they had to show why talk of ends clarified rather than obscured nature. Against lovers of pure verbal victory, they had to defend logic as a tool for truth, not merely a game of traps. Against political realists, they had to argue that ethics and civic life could not be separated. The result was not peace. It was education. Imagine a morning in the Lyceum. A student brings a report about a coastal creature, perhaps from fishermen who know its habits better than philosophers do. The group asks what can be trusted, what must be checked, what the animal's parts are for, how it reproduces, how it moves. Later, the conversation turns to a city's constitution. What makes one arrangement stable and another brittle? What kind of citizen does each regime produce? By afternoon, the discussion may shift to tragedy. Why do human beings take pleasure in staged suffering? What does pity do? What does fear teach? To modern ears, this range may sound scattered. To Aristotle, it was connected. The world had many regions, but reason could move among them if it kept its questions clear. The Lyceum trained students to believe that the same mind could care about shellfish and statesmanship, grammar and goodness, proof and friendship. That breadth became part of the school's appeal. A young person who entered Aristotle's orbit did not receive a narrow specialization. He entered a whole intellectual climate. He learned that definitions matter, that examples matter, that causes matter, that habits matter. He learned to distrust both vague inspiration and empty cleverness. He learned that knowledge takes work, collecting, comparing, sorting, testing, revising. There was also a political shadow around the school. Aristotle had been tutor to Alexander of Macedon, and Athens never forgot the Macedonian presence. After Alexander's death, anti-Macedonian feeling surged, and Aristotle left the city rather than risk the fate of Socrates. The charge against him was impiety, but the atmosphere was political. Philosophy did not float above power. The Lyceum's fortunes were tied, at least in public imagination, to Macedonian influence, royal education, and the new Hellenistic world being opened by conquest. We should be careful here. It would be too simple to say that Alexander became an Aristotelian king, marching across Asia with the Nicomachean ethics in his heart. History gives us no such clean story. Alexander's ambitions were military, dynastic, mythic, and personal. Yet Aristotle's role as tutor gave philosophy a new visibility. It suggested that rulers might be educated by thinkers, that knowledge of nature, rhetoric, ethics, and politics might belong in the training of power. Even if Alexander did not govern as Aristotle would have wished, the symbolic ripple was large. The philosopher had stood near the throne. After Aristotle's death, the school continued. Theophrastus led it with distinction. Later came Strato of Lampsacus, who leaned more strongly toward natural explanation. The peripatetic tradition would change, fade, revive, be edited, commented on, misunderstood, and rediscovered. Aristotle's own writings had a complicated fate. Many of the works we read feel like lecture notes or internal school materials rather than finished literary books. Their survival depended on chains of preservation that were fragile and sometimes obscure. But the immediate follower base had already done something essential. It had made Aristotle more than a brilliant individual. It had made him a practice. That practice traveled because it was useful. A student could take it to Rhodes, Alexandria, Pergamum, or a court where rulers wanted educated advisors. Scholars in libraries could use it to organize scrolls and subjects. Doctors could use it to think about bodies. Moralists could use it to examine character. Political thinkers could use it to compare constitutions. Teachers could use it to train young minds in orderly speech and judgment. Of course, the method carried limitations. Aristotle's confidence in natural hierarchy would later support ugly arguments about slavery, women, and social rank. His teleology, so illuminating in some contexts, could harden into a habit of seeing purposes where there were only inherited assumptions. His biology, though often observant, remained limited by ancient tools and reports. The Lyceum's carefulness was real, but it was not modern science. Its circle of full participants was narrow, shaped by the exclusions of Greek civic life. There is another caution too. We know the early peripatetics through damaged evidence. Some works survive whole, others in fragments, others only as names in later catalogues. Ancient biographies can be gossipy. Later commentators sometimes preserve a sentence while losing the argument around it. So the first generation of Aristotle's followers must be imagined with humility. We can see outlines: Theophrastus among plants, Eudemus among histories of knowledge, Aristoxenus among tones and rhythms, Dicaeurchus among maps and civic life. We cannot reconstruct every conversation or every disagreement. That uncertainty should not make the story smaller. It makes it more human. The Lyceum was not a machine producing identical Aristotles. It was a living school, and living schools leave uneven traces. Students borrow, resist, misunderstand, improve, and carry away what they can use. Some probably loved Aristotle's classifications more than his metaphysics. Some may have preferred his biology to his ethics. Some surely argued with him in ways no surviving page records. Influence begins in that messy region between loyalty and independence. Still, the ripple is undeniable. In the shaded walks of the Lyceum, philosophy became communal labor. The first Aristotelians were not merely fans. They were collaborators, heirs, critics, and specialists. They kept asking Aristotle's kind of questions long after Aristotle himself was gone. A doctrine can be memorized and die. A method can be practiced and live. That was the Lyceum's quiet triumph. The walking school taught people how to look at the world as if it were intelligible, how to argue as if reasons mattered, and how to build a community around the shared discipline of understanding. From those walks came a current strong enough to reach botanists, theologians, jurists, physicians, political theorists, and teachers in centuries Aristotle could never have imagined. The ripple began with footsteps.